Good evening, everyone. Once again, I'm here, Edward Akintola Hubbard. I am co-curator of the IMPAKT Festival 2026 Techno-Ancestrality. And unfortunately, this is the last panel of the festival. And so, I hope we all enjoy it and dig in very deeply. This panel is called, or is titled, Transgenerational Counter-Coding. And we put this panel together because we really wanted to look at how ancestral knowledge is often used to bend and twist systems of oppression, systems of surveillance, and systems of extraction. How ancestral cultures typically find their own ways of repurposing everyday objects and everyday gestures to suit their own ends and to hack these systems. So we have a stellar lineup for you, and I will just start by calling them slowly, one by one, to the stage. And we'll begin with Adriana Churampi Ramirez, who was born in Peru. She studied Latin American literature at Leiden and is now a lecturer in Latin American literature at the Faculty of Humanities of Leiden University. Her current research concentrates on the study of written materials depicting the indigenous population of the Andes region, mainly novels, but also images and even comics. Churampi's research deals with concepts such as identity and representation, key themes that are core to most recent conflicts in Andean countries. I would like to welcome to the stage Adriana. Yes, no, you can take a seat. Yes. Up next is Evelyn Wan, Assistant Professor of Media Arts and Society here at Utrecht University in the Department of Media and Culture Studies. In the last 15 years, Wan has worked on theater projects with asylum seeker youths and has collaborated with various international artists in staging contemporary dance, physical theater, and site-specific performances as both performer and dramaturge. Her current performance practice uses artistic research methods that intersect technology, colonial and inter-Asian ocean histories, mythology, and spirituality. I'd like to welcome my very good friend, Evelyn. And last but not least, two exhibiting artists in this year's IMPAKT Festival. Their work, you can find it at the IMPAKT headquarters, are the Muenela brothers, Inti, Muenela Vega brothers, I should say, Inti and Yauri. Inti Muenela Vega is a visual artist, Mendeley, and cultural manager. He studied art at the Central University of Ecuador. A multidisciplinary artist, he frequently works with painting, video, art, ritual, performance, and drawing. He explores the spiritual relationships of Andean thought with symbolic geometry, eco-social issues, identity, and migration. Let's welcome Inti. Thank you. Just take a seat. Finally, Yauri Muenela Vega, Inti's brother, is a visual artist, educator, and currently a cultural activator at Yachai Tech University. He has served as a research professor at the National University of Education. He holds a master's degree in visual anthropology from the Latin American Faculty of Social Sciences. In his artistic practice, he explores the connections between craftsmanship and intercultural collaborative practices. Thank you very much. And shall I welcome to the stage the translator for Yauri and Inti, Lisa. So nice to meet you. So I guess we'll just start with a presentation from each of our invited guests, and I believe Adriana? Yes.
This time, I would like to begin by the beginning, from the colonial of the first moment that the Western world entered or contacted the Abya Yala, what we call today Latin America. There was, in this encounter, we only have references that are coming from Spanish colonial sources. and they depict the moment in their own categories, from their own perspective, and that's the official version that we have until today. There was a main order given to the travelers, to call that the colonists, and that was uncover the secret of the land to be explored. And that's very important because the idea was to discover everything, to ask for everything, and as a way to appropriate everything, every knowledge, every spiritual descriptions, as well as the whole material products. I have an example here from the other version, because we have a lot of descriptions about the colonial sources, because they are part of the Western culture. But we know very few about the other perspective, and that is the indigenous perspective. One of the few colonial writers, indigenous colonial writers, is Huamán Poma de Ayala, a 16th century writer that dared to produce an own version about this moment, the very important encounter between these two worlds. One of the examples that I like you to present to identify to create the basis what I want to describe today is this manuscript of Huamán Poma. One of the examples that he presents is the description of an Indian astrologer poet that knows. That is the description of, that's the way that he finds in Spanish to describe the process of planting edible products. As you can imagine, if we analyze this description from the Western perspective, it's quite weird. It's quite difficult to understand, because what he's trying to present us is explaining us that planting edible products means or needs sometimes of memory, numerical memory that was during the Inca period reserved in quipus, and spiritual memory, that's the connection with traditions. The tradition in this case are called the apus, that sign the spirits that were needed to the simple task of planting products. And then, because it was, he conceived that as a creative process, the only way that he needs to express that in Spanish is using the word poetry. As you can imagine, this kind of description was only discovered in the years, more or less, in the 20th century. Before that, it was absolutely considered a very wrong description, a very unintelligible way to describe who knows what. And that's what I call, for example, the gaps in indigenous written products. In modern times, we have other phenomena that are present. One is the presence of tourism, the overwhelming tourism, in the sense that they are all over the place, and that's kind of a mandatory phenomenon, because it means in the economic market system, the only way to survive for some groups in society, included the indigenous communities. The market economy is creating a lot of dynamics that are unavoidable. Another phenomenon of modern times is the forced revitalization. That means that it's not the initiative of the indigenous populations to initiate this kind of revitalization, it's the product of these political games in official institutions that force the whole procedure, the process to revitalize some cultural practices. And then we are aware of this global commodification. Everything is to sell or to buy. What is the answer of indigenous communities to all of these phenomena that mean a loss of tradition, that means a commodification of things that are considered sacred? Number one is performing indigeneity. So you want to buy me dressed like this next to my alpaca, I will produce that for you. I will perform that for you, and you are going to pay me for that. That's bad a bad experience for tourists because they feel cheated. But let's remember, we are coming from two different perspectives. In a market perspective, that's the law of you ask for something and you get for that. That is the market. But in the case of the indigenous population entering and exiting this market system, it's a bad thing. Another answer is to regain and to defend their own voice. The indigenous communities produce their own explanations. They let them hear their own voices about culture and creation, and they have to fight for that because nobody believes them. Everybody thinks we can understand their categories because they are not Western. They are weird ways to see the world, forgetting that we are talking about two different ways to understand the world. And in this context, what's the last frontier that we can find? The political discussion that is happening is quite difficult, and it's quite hard, and it can become quite violent. There is a very silence strategy, and that is secrecy. Some indigenous communities allowed these manifestations of touristic performance, but they keep always a frontier that what is to show and what is intimate, culturally intimate. What is untouchable is something that you don't open to the rest of the world. That's your own, that is unique, and that's the essence of the identity. Is that bad to preserve that? It's only logical to do that. So silence in this way, secrecy in this way, is a way of cultural survival. And as such a strategy is political. And that creates a lot of reflection and questions about this demanding of authenticity. Only when we are talking with indigenous communities and their productions, the cultural productions, we, and I mean we, the powerful world, Western world, or other powerful partners that are in position to demand authenticity, they want to hear everything. The knowledge has to be absolutely open to know in order to become yours, in order to appropriate all of this knowledge, products, earth, spirituality. And then I have the impression that it's a way to recreate the absolutely lack of dialogue from the 16th century, from the beginning of my presentation. At that moment, the communication, the dialogue, the intercultural dialogue, because two cultures in the same position dialogue with each other, was impossible because, number one, they couldn't understand each other. If you read the Columbus diaries, he said, I don't understand a word. The only thing that I know is that these people don't have a language. That's a powerful statement, not in the sense that he is showing us facts. He is showing us how power works. And that's more or less the line that is still guiding this impossibility to talk in the same position, being aware that they are two different ways to approach the world. And that is what I wanted to discuss today, or to present to you today, that we have to be aware that we are not going to guide these other people in their way to know the world, because they have their own way to do it. They know the world in the same position that the Western world knows how to analyze the future. They are two parallel ways, and they have to exist in that way. Thank you.
Sorry, I would like to welcome Evelyn Wan to the stage.
So good afternoon. Thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. And I think we're going to hear some echoes in my presentation also with what you're saying. So today I want to share with you several snapshots into my research creation project, which is called Archaeologies of AI. So I do this project through the method of media archaeology, where I trace alternative genealogies from historical to contemporary technologies in order to shed new light on them. So archaeologies, like that means that I dig into history, I go into archives, and I also use the term archaeology in a Foucauldian manner, thinking about the powers and ideologies that have made certain knowledges and certain technologies prominent in our world rather than others. And what I want to do with this project is to reimagine possibilities of our technological futures by looking at forgotten pasts and presents. And throughout this project, as I embarked on this research, I noticed that what emerged was the theme of spiritual technologies, which have been used by women and people of color. And these technologies have never been given the same status as supposedly rational and scientific technology. And the photos you see here is a lecture performance I did in 2024, where I looked at historical crossovers between telegraph cable technology. This is a photo that I took at Tyler's Museum in Harlem. And there are crossovers with seances, which at the time was known as spiritual telegraphs. So at the time when the first transatlantic cable was laid, around 1850s to 60s, people in Europe and North America were actually in a frenzy about communicating with dead people on the other side. And how did they do that? They did that through female mediums. And maybe you guys don't know, Thomas Edison, when he created the telephone, in fact, he was trying to create a necrophone, which he can use to listen to dead people talking. So in fact, the history of communication technology itself, even within Europe, is riddled with the supernatural and with the esoteric. But this has simply been written out of our common knowledge. So the project really takes on this decolonial perspective where I turn to multicultural contexts of technology and challenge the rational, the scientific, capitalist biases in what we now know as tech, such that we shift towards a pluriversal perspective instead, where we center multicultural knowledges and eco-philosophical episteme with earth and nature at the center of everything. And that is, of course, something that is part and parcel of many other cultures in the world. I start from a situated perspective as someone from Hong Kong, working in the Netherlands here as part of the European Academy. So Hong Kong has been a former British colony. It's undergone 156 years of colonial occupation. And in 1995, it's been returned to China, so it is now under Chinese rule. As part of this, it really means relearning Chinese cosmologies and philosophies for myself, something that I pretty much never really gotten into when I was a child because that was always seen as something superstitious, not really worth learning, right? Learn the kind of Anglo education curriculum that you're supposed to be studying and forget about these older traditional knowledges that's not so important. But as part of global majority in the European Academy, I think it's also really important that while I do this project, I also think about and help everyone around me rediscover what has also been marginalized within Europe. Because the decolonial perspective requires not only including more diverse perspectives, but also attending to the violence Europe committed towards itself through, for instance, the witch hunts in the early modern period, which has severely damaged Europe's relations to their own traditional knowledges like magic and plant medicine. So it's really not just about reaching outwards to other places on Earth, or reaching backwards in time as some sort of pre-colonial nostalgia, but to have a critical look at ourselves in the here and now, and think about how the deep time of the past and the deep time of the future converge in the present, where we're actively able to intervene and make different choices. So to me, archaeologies of AI have always felt like a time travel project where I'm like a little time traveler trying to live in multiple times, in multiple cosmologies and worlds as I immerse myself in the research. I turn towards ancestral technologies, towards technologies that have been here since time immemorial, given to us by gods, mythical creatures, non-humans, with different senses of nonlinear time or cyclical time that they bring with them. What is important for me is that while I root in my own traditional culture and speak more specifically about East Asian cosmologies, I also want there to be transversal linkages with other parts of the world, like an Afro-Asian axis, for instance, so that a broader conversation and discourse can be built. So in the photos here, I'm going to talk about what I've been working on the last couple of years, which is I Ching and IFA divination, as inspirations for non-binary computation and as alternative forms of mathematics. So I Ching is represented here in the orange diagram. It's also known as the Book of Changes, and it's a philosophy representing yin and yang energy in the cosmos. And yin and yang really kind of refers to, let's say, more kind of masculine energy in the yang energy and more feminine energy in the yin energy. But these two energies are always co-present and in flux, and they're never really meant to be two opposite things, but that they are on a spectrum and that they're constantly in flux with each other, which is why in the yin-yang diagram that you always see, there's always a black dot on the white side and always a white dot on the black side, which signifies that both are always present at the same time. But what we also see is that these yin-yang energies are represented by the broken and unbroken lines, which together form codes. And these codes, known as trigrams, these ones here are trigrams, or hexagrams. When they're doubled up, they're 6 lines, so hexagrams. They represent different states of nature, like sky, water, mountain, thunder, earth, etc. And this system has been given to the Chinese by an ancient god named Fu Xi, or Fo Hei in Cantonese. And it's often depicted as this half-human, half-serpent figure. And you see that in the, this is like from an archaeological kind of image. And he's the one holding the angular ruler, the male god. And the diviner would use trigrams or hexagrams to understand the state of a certain situation and its predicted trajectory, and would give advice according to principles of harmony and balance with the cosmos that is represented by the I Ching. The other system I'm interested in, IFA divination, which you see in the 2 photos on the bottom, that was also brought up by Tabitha Razia last night in her keynote. And this was taught to the Yoruba people in West Africa by Orunmila, who's the Orisha of wisdom, knowledge, and divination. He taught people to recognize the interconnectedness of all beings and embrace the rhythms and cycles of nature. And what the diviner does in this case, he would throw 8 half kola nuts or cowrie shells onto a divination board, and these shells are lined up in pairs, creating a binary system of either open or closed shells. So you can see the divining bead like to the side of the image. And you see also how they draw the answers to the divination on this sand board, right, with, again, a kind of binary representation. So 2 to the power 8, mathematics, that gives us 256 possible combinations within this binary system. And with these 256 combinations come many verses for interpretation, handed down to generations through oral transmission. And these verses contain then the divine wisdom on how to tackle the question at hand, again, in relation to the cosmological principles of their culture. And here you see a binary code or hex code that's been developed based on the IFA by Professor Olulonge in the 80s when he was pondering the possibilities of what an African contribution to computer science could be. And this was taken from his inaugural lecture when he became the very first professor on the African continent of computer science. So you might wonder, why did I bring up these 2 divination technologies? We often think about numbers as innocent, neutral figures, or that they are universal. Our entire computation, of course, is built on the logic of ones and zeros. But both the I Ching and the IFA system show a different vision of binary mathematics, that codes can emerge from cosmological beliefs in harmony with nature and serve as representations of ethical relations. Right? These people come to the diviners asking for advice, how should I act in this particular case? And then these principles, right, from the philosophies guide them through the binary code. There's a much larger story here that I don't have time to really dive into, but it's about how Leibniz, when he invented the binary arithmetic in 1701, was in fact inspired by the I Ching, while completely misinterpreting it. He was in correspondence with a Jesuit priest in Beijing who was there on a colonizing mission to civilize the Chinese, and this priest sent him the images of the I Ching. What we maybe don't know is that Leibniz's binary arithmetic is actually deeply, deeply Christian. If you go back into the archive to his notes and letters, the idea of 0 and 1 actually represented to him how God, out of nothing, 0, created life, 1, and how beautiful it is to represent all of that just through 2 numbers. And he proposed to the Jesuit priest to use these 2 numbers to match with the I Ching binary so that the Chinese would be convinced of the great creator God, the Christian God. So in fact, the binary arithmetic at the heart of computation today has Christian coloniality in its foundation. So as a next step and a larger ambition in this research, my goal is to draw inspiration around I Ching and IFA mathematics as systems where ethics and ecological principles of harmony and balance are really built in from the get-go, and to imagine different forms of computation through them. At IMPAKT this year, we've had the privilege of entering a living and breathing archive of ancestral technologies. And in closing, I want to share with you a zine that I created especially for this event, which is something that I feel like captures a lot more to what I've been doing in this project. It's a nonlinear reflective tool that invites you to relate to these different technologies that I've assembled from various cultures, departing from the idea that the future is ancestral, that is by leading Indigenous activist from Brazil, Elton Krenak. So it's a little gift for you to take home. You can take 1 copy when you leave the room as a kind of time capsule of this moment of engagement, because I think that the colonial process isn't just out there, but it's really like in here, something that we have to activate through thinking about counter-coding and activating these tools so that we would actually live differently, right? Mind, body, and spirit. We've seen many examples of ancestral technologies at the festival, in the exhibitions, but how do we actually individually and collectively relate to them, right? Can we integrate and embody these ideas? How do we build new systems of computation with them in mind? So just to give a very quick example of how you can use this, this is if you look at the ancestral side and you open it up, it will actually take you into the future. If you open the future side, it will take you in the past. And when you read the prompt, there's a little card that tells you more about the technology that inspired this, and you can write about your own reflection here. And just to kind of give you an example, this one here stemmed from my research into grief bots and grief rituals from my home culture. And as I was thinking about how grief bots are these bots, right, that can be created based on data from your loved ones after they die, and it really makes you hold on to them as if they're still alive. But if you think about Buddhist ideas of death and impermanence, it's really about letting go and forgetting, right? So I have to kind of reimagine what if forgetting is really part and parcel of our technologies, right? Instead of memory, instead of holding on to everything, and how that could change our ways of like design and thinking about technology in the future. Another example, this has been brought up by Angelina Kuma's presentation yesterday, the idea of deep time, quoting Lakota decision-making processes where you have to think about 7 generations into the future in terms of how you can make a decision. So this is for you to kind of think through. So for me, transgeneration counter-coding unfolds these other possibilities of being, invites us to really think through time differently and help us sort of insist on non-extractive values and integrate ethics as a protocol. So like the I Ching and IFA example, its ethics has to be so fully embedded in how we think and act and live. So it's not an afterthought after a new technology has been invented, but really something that we incorporate from the get-go. So you can also download a copy of the zine through the QR code or the link, or you can take one on your way out. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And now we will welcome the Muanela Vega brothers and the translator to this podium.
Alituta, Alishamushka Kapaichi, buenas tardes con todos.
Good afternoon, everyone.
Quiero agradecer a las organizaciones de IMPAKT, especialmente este día, ¿no? Por permitir que nuestras voces, nuestras historias, nuestros sueños puedan ser compartidos.
He wants to thank IMPAKT to allow their voices, their stories to be shared here.
También deseo hacer un saludo muy especial desde el corazón a nuestros ancestros, a quienes caminaron antes que nosotros, a nuestros abuelos, a nuestros padres, a la comunidad y a todas las generaciones pasadas que con su esfuerzo, su lucha y su sabiduría han hecho posible que hoy estemos aquí.
He also wants to send a very heartfelt thank you to their ancestors, the people who walked before them, the previous generation, parents, grandfathers, and other members of the family.
Nuestro proyecto se ha nutrido de experiencias como quichuas de Otavalos.
This will help. Thank you. Our project has been nurtured from experiences as Quichua Otavayo,
donde las preguntas y reflexiones sobre la identidad, la espiritualidad y la relación con la Pachamama tejen un vínculo entre el pasado, presente y el futuro.
where the questions and reflections about identity, spirituality, and the relationship with the Pachamama weave a link between the past, the present, and the future.
Identidad cortada.
Cut out identity.
Voy a hablar sobre esta obra que es muy personal, que me ha llevado a muchas preguntas y reflexiones acerca de identidad, resistencia y recuerdos.
I'm going to speak about this work, which is a very personal one, and that has taken me to many questions and reflections about identity, resistance, and remembrance.
La instalación artística recurre a imágenes de archivos familiares para visualizar las violentas y significativas interrupciones en las transiciones intergeneracionales de los saberes, símbolos y códigos de los pueblos y nacionalidades indígenas.
This artistic installation recurs to images, archival images from family archival images to visualize the violent and significant interruptions in. I have my microphone. No worries. Thank you. In the intergenerational transmission of knowledge, symbols, and codes of indigenous communities and nationalities.
En nuestra modernidad colonial, el Estado, los gobiernos, la Iglesia y la sociedad blanco-mestiza han negado, marginado y discriminado la lengua, los valores, la espiritualidad, la vestimenta, los símbolos diversos como la trenza que expresa una singularidad, identificación cultural.
In our modern coloniality, the states, the governments, and the church, and the society, white mestiza, have neglected, marginalized, and discriminated language, values, spirituality, such as dressing, symbols, such as the braid, that express a very singular cultural identity.
Frente a diversos tipos de violencia, muchas personas y familias quichuas, en su afán de proteger y cuidar a sus hijos e hijas del descrimen, eligieron con pesar cortarse la trenza elemento profundamente sagrado ligado a la identidad cultural.
Confronting different types of violence, many people and Quechua families wanting to protect or care for their sons and daughters from discrimination, they chose to cut their braid, an element profoundly sacred and linked to the cultural identity.
Este es un caso personal donde está mi hijo en la imagen cortándose el pelo para poder entrar a otros espacios que igual, o sea, por discriminación, de pronto igual él quiso ser aceptado.
The images shows his own son cutting her braid because of wanting to be accepted and access other sort of spaces that he would not have been allowed to.
La identidad cortada debe las situaciones de vulnerabilidad individual que se entretejen con una realidad colectiva.
Cut-out identity reveals the situations of vulnerability that interweave within a reality collective, with a collective reality.
Las decisiones que impulsan a cortarse la trenza evidencian un hecho colonial innegable que persiste en el tiempo, manifestados en el racismo y la discriminación.
The decisions that push people to cut out their braids make evident a colonial fact that it's unavoidable and that persists time, and it's still manifested in racism, discrimination, and express a very fragile utopia of building truly diverse and plural societies.
Y expresa la fragilidad y utopía de construir sociedades verdaderamente diversas y plurales.
Adelante.
La identidad cortada debe la situación partiendo de imágenes fotográficas desde el archivo familiar en conexión con referencias de documentos personales y legales que definen la identidad individual y colectiva, se problematiza la fragilidad continuidad de los elementos sagrados y simbólicos de los pueblos indígenas, como la trenza y la lengua.
Family archive. Departing from photographic images from the family archive, connecting them with references from personal documents and legal documents that define individual and collective identity, it problematizes the fragile continuity of the sacred and symbolic elements of the indigenous peoples, such as the braid and the language.
Más allá de la representación de la trenza física que evoca la fuerza y la resistencia identitaria ubicada junto a la imagen del momento en que Ranti Gabriel, mi hijo, se corta su trenza, se cruzan y constatan sentidos de fragilidad y fortaleza que nos llevan a preguntarnos.
Beyond representation, the braid represents the physical strength and the identitarian resistance that lays within the image of the moment in which Ranti Gabriel Monala cuts his braid. Here, senses of fragility and strength are crossing, and this takes us to question.
¿Qué factores sociales inciden en la pérdida de elementos identitarios de los pueblos y nacionalidades?
What are the social factors that lead to the loss of identitarian elements of the peoples and nationalities?
¿Qué elementos sagrados de los pueblos y nacionalidades trascienden generaciones?
What sacred elements from peoples and nationalities transcends generation after generations?
La dimensión política, estética y simbólica.
Political dimension, aesthetics and symbolics.
Las diversas formas de discriminación, tanto físicas como simbólicas, vulneran el derecho a la diversidad cultural, étnica y lingüística.
The different forms of discriminations towards different physical forms as symbolic forms vulnerate the right to a cultural, ethnic, and linguistic diversity,
poniendo en riesgo la preservación del sentido perteneciente y de identidad.
putting in risk the preservation of the belonging sense and identity sense.
Frente a la asimilación y la aculturación, el cuidado de los procesos de resistencia que se van transformando entre generaciones se sostiene por una memoria colectiva.
Confronting cultural appropriation and assimilation taking care of processes of resistance that transform generation after generation is sustained thanks to a collective memory.
La práctica de espiritualidades propias y la afirmación de identidad cultural.
The practice of spiritualities and the affirmation of a cultural identity.
Nos atrevemos a levantar la voz desde el arte
We dare to raise our voices from art,
por el derecho a la diferencia,
for the right to be different,
identidad y dignidad,
for our identities and dignity,
el derecho a pensar, creer, hablar, crear de manera propia,
for the right to think, to believe, to inhabit, and to create on an own way,
el derecho a ser la continuidad de nuestros pueblos y llevar con orgullo nuestros elementos sagrados y culturales.
the right to be the continuity of our peoples and to take with pride our sacred and cultural elements.
Nos quieren sacar de nuestros territorios, pero son nuestros ancestros.
They want to take us away from our territories, but they are our ancestors.
Nos quieren cortar nuestras trenzas, pero son nuestras semillas, nuestras raíces.
They want to cut out our braids, but they are our roots.
Thank you.
Alituta Machicuna, muy buenas tardes con todos. Por el tiempo cortito que tenemos en este momento voy a intentar ligar la pieza que mi hermano presentó con la pieza que presentamos para la exhibición IMPAKT.
Good afternoon, everybody. Because we have very little time, he's going to try to connect the work that his brother has just presented with the work that is present in the IMPAKT Festival.
Acá nuevamente con imágenes recurrimos al archivo. Hace un momento se presentó un archivo muy personal. Abrir el álbum familiar de un momento muy nostálgico, ¿no? De ver a un hijo cortarse su elemento identitario como la trenza.
We are now back to the family archive, and we have just seen a very personal archive, and we have witnessed a very intimate moment of a son cutting out his own braid.
Acá vemos el archivo de mi hermano, justo, es la partida de nacimiento. Él nace en 1978 y el registro civil le niega la posibilidad de inscribir su nombre a mis padres en lengua quichua. Le querían colocar Inti y no le permitieron.
So here we can see the birth certificate of his brother from 1978. Here in the register, their parents were denied the possibility of naming him with the name Inti, which is the Quichua naming.
En la parte de abajo vemos justamente que en 1996 él al cumplir los 18 años va al registro civil y reescribe su nombre. Hay un proceso legal para reescribir su nombre.
In 1996, when he was 18 years old, he goes to the register and starts a legal process to change his name.
Este archivo nos llevó a preguntarnos algo que nos atraviesa la identidad, la memoria, la dignidad y la resistencia.
This archive makes us a question that traverses our identity, our memory, our resistance, and our dignity.
Y en este caso, mis padres, mis abuelos tuvieron distintos campos de acción, desde el tejido, tema educativo, en nuestro caso el arte.
In this sense, their parents and grandparents had different realms through which they could act, such as the tejido, the weaving, education, and in their case, art.
Y nos preguntamos tres cosas para con la pieza intentar responder.
And they are asking three things that they are trying to also answer through their work.
Cómo el arte acompaña los procesos de resistencia y reivindicación identitaria, espiritual y política.
How can art accompany this process of resistance, of reivindication in an identitary, spiritual, and political way?
cómo el arte nos permite sanar a nosotros, ¿no es cierto?, de las heridas coloniales que se mantienen en el tiempo.
How can art facilitate healing processes from the colonial, still latent wounds?
Y cómo el arte puede hilar justamente el pasado, presente y futuro.
And how can art weave together past, present, and future?
Por temas de tiempo, les presentaré un poco las imágenes
Because of the
del
short time,
proceso.
he's going to only share a few images of the process.
Pero quiero detenerme en esta imagen que nos llevó a conocer un proceso de los años 70 de los pioneros, ¿sí?, que iniciaron en el proceso de cambio de nombre. Justamente Nina Pacari, lideresa histórica del movimiento indígena, fue una de las primeras personas que empezó a pensar de forma colectiva el poder recuperar sus nombres quichuas.
He's going to stop for a moment in this image because this reflects about a process that started in the 70s with the pioneers that started the process of name changing. And here we have leaderess Nina Pacari, a historical leaderess of the movement, the Indigenous movement, and pioneer in naming restitution in Quechua language.
Y a partir de ella descubrimos un taller que se crea en los años 78, justo el año que nace mi hermano, el taller cultural Causanajunchic.
And thanks to this woman, they discovered a very special workshop that was created in 1978, precisely the year that Inti was born. And that is the taller, the workshop.
Causanajunchic.
Causanajunchic is the name of the workshop.
Y esta categoría nos permite entender, es una palabra en lengua quichua que hace referencia a nuestros procesos de resistencia. Hemos vivido, vivimos y viviremos.
And this word connects to the processes of resistance. We have lived, we lived, and we will live.
Sí, por temas de tiempo llegamos hasta ahí. Muchísimas gracias.
And this is it.
Thank you to all four of our presenters tonight. Yes, I'm full of questions, and I think maybe we could just sort of, I know we don't have much time, but ask one question along the line and then open it up to the audience, because I'm sure the audience is full of questions too. So let's start with Adriana. I think your talk had me, of course, we were both giggling at some of the things you were saying because, yeah, I'm very, very fascinated by your work on cultural tourism and how deeply extractive that is. And while you were talking, I was remembering the time that, someone told me that I should go to, you should try out these ayahuasca retreats in the Netherlands, here in the Netherlands, and I went on the website and there are thousands of euros. Like, it's very expensive. And so I was really thinking about all the times I've heard my students and other people say, well, cultural appropriation it's a ridiculous concept because we've always exchanged culture, as if there isn't a sort of economy of extraction around cultural appropriation. I just wondered if you could talk a little bit more about that. I really am fascinated by this, and especially what you said about secrecy and the need to protect, because we heard this on Thursday from a Maroon speaker who refused to tell us on stage why, whether or not they were really going to be publicizing this sort of Maroon text that was recently invented, a form of Maroon script. But he said the same things. We have to be secret. We can't let them know everything. But I would love to hear you talk about that.
Yeah, I was.
Is it on?
Hello? Yeah. I was also, I'm very interested in this kind of products, the commodification of spirituality, for example, because at which point do we approach another culture with the idea not only to listen, not only to admire, to exchange, but also to appropriate the essence of spirituality? Is it possible to appropriate spirituality? Because that's the propaganda when you buy this kind of tours of ayahuasca, of other kind of things is that they don't sell you, they also sell you the product, but they sell you mindfulness, they give you tranquility, they give you a reborn experience. And that is, for example, the essence of a misunderstanding. Or maybe not even a misunderstanding, they didn't even listen, or they didn't even try to understand, sometimes it's almost impossible, what's the essence of the process or the spirituality of the other culture that they are confronting. And in their effort to just to gain some profit, they just take a couple of names, a couple of strange words, and they mixed all of this with another elements like yoga, like mindfulness, and they create a product, and they sell it to the persons that are thirsty to tranquility, to relaxation. So in that sense, I was thinking that is the market economy that's playing a role here. And number two, the idea that you can possess the spirituality of the other culture only after having some kind of a workshop, that's very a form of entitlement. Which moment did we realize that the disrespect for the culture of the other person, of the other group, that we think that that is possible? When the other way happens, for example, when somebody from other culture approach the Western culture and say, well, after a couple of workshops, after I will be able to be a part of this society, it's very well criticized.
Yes.
The people they have a name for that. They even punish this kind of attitudes. But it is well allowed when it happens to other cultures because they are the otherness. Otherness is always a definition that means that they have another degree of validation. It's possible to do that. And in that sense, that's quite, it's a game of power. It's how the attitude to believe that you can possess the spirituality of another culture is, for me, absolutely unbelievable.
Yeah, yeah. But just one more thing is about this, the strategic, the silence as a strategy for protection, for cultural protection, secrecy. I'm really fascinated by this because I was, before hearing you speak, I was, or at least the way you opened up, I was thinking to myself, it's actually quite good when tourists get screwed over, when they come to these places and they get their eyes gouged out with all these exorbitant prices for these things. Go ahead. But you're saying, no, it's what's even more strategic is to just hold back, just withhold information and let them think that they're getting what they're getting, but lie, I love this. I really do.
Yeah. I think that's also, we have to realize, or we have to reflect when we ask during these happenings, they feel, the tourists feel shocked when they discover that after all of this performance, the person goes to the daily life that's as modern as the tourists themselves.
Yeah.
So they feel cheated, and I don't understand that because you're asking for that.
Yes, exactly.
And that's when the secrecy or it's just a simple question of frontiers.
Yeah.
When somebody visits your house, you get annoyed if this person wants to know all your bedroom, your toilet, etc.
Right.
It's a question of simple frontiers. I will receive you in one room, and the rest is my house. It's exactly the same principle.
Yeah.
I will allow you to participate in some of my very private religious celebrations, but of course don't ask for more. That's part of my identity that I need to protect.
Yeah.
And that's what I get annoyed when this claim for authenticity goes, and my first reaction is, who do you think you are to ask for authenticity,
Yeah.
to demand authenticity?
Right.
That's something to reflect about.
I know, very much so. Moving on to Evelyn. Evelyn, honestly, I just only recently started reading about the IFA system. I had known about the I Ching for, since I was an undergrad. But I think what you said here and the history you unpacked is fascinating. Especially the fact that, yes, I didn't know at all that binary arithmetic was rooted in, as you say, Christian colonialism, Christian coloniality. That blows my mind. But I guess my question is, I think, is it enough just to unearth these two sort of non-Western systems? Isn't the decolonial project getting these systems to talk to each other? Somehow, I was wondering.
Yeah, I think that's really been
And how do we do that, by the way?
Well, that's a really hard question, right? And I think it's going to take us the next, decades of commitment to these issues to really think about how we can build technologies that reverse that, or at least offer alternatives to let's say this binary logic that is completely steeped in colonial history. I think kind of also in relation to what you're saying, right? This kind of ayahuasca tourism. Part of the reason why I kind of continuously emphasize that, when we're doing this decolonial work, it's not now let's learn more about one particular culture and incorporate that into the system. We really need to think about there are multiple majority cultures that are represented, and also what does Europe do with that information, or what does sort of the center do with what has been always seen as periphery? And if, let's say, for instance, if Europeans can go back to thinking about, okay, what have we actually lost? Let's say if they have sort of tried to revive even more their own, let's say, witchcraft practices, maybe they don't need to go to, do ayahuasca tourism, right? In fact, these things are all here. We've just forgotten in some way. That's just not, let's say, so popular. There are, of course, many circles of witches who have persisted, right? But I think those are really important things to think about, those kinds of cross-conversations, cross-fertilizations that's happening. And it's always a very tricky terrain because, there can be accusations, critiques of appropriation here. But I think in a way, we also have to be very realistic, these technologies, the tech that we have now really are destroying Earth. So how can we bring together different peoples, different cultures to really think about what is next? What can we have next?
Well, I wonder about what you just said there about Europeans. It's, so much of the European imperial project is about suppressing all that stuff. Is to say, no, we don't do those things. It's them over there who do these things. So is this even possible in Europe? For Europeans to really rediscover folk tradition and so on? I think it's a fascinating question.
Yeah. So that's why, actually, the project. This whole project kind of started with the colonial archive of the first transatlantic cable. That was the first thing that I went into because I think this is about going back into this moment of spiritualism that is around 19th century Europe, in the Victorian age in particular, where this is actually very active. And science was not divorced from these experimentations with the other side. And in fact, the people who were participating in these seance experiments, these were the learned gentlemen of the day, right? So I think recuperating those histories also really is quite confronting, recognizing, hey, there was once a time that these things were not separate, and we all know it, right? How can we revive that in some way to open up that kind of cosmological belief, that different worlds, right? Also for, so to speak, the center.
Incredible. And let me now turn to the Monela Vega brothers. I thank you so much for your amazing artwork, which is really one of the centerpieces of the IMPAKT exhibition this year. And I think the story that you told and the story of the artwork itself is so fascinating. And tragic. I guess my question is, the fact that you still have to use a legal process to claim a name that belonged to you. Is that still hurtful? Does it still hurt?
First, he's congratulating you on your presentation and your beautiful work. Ay, perdón, es una de las piezas centrales.
She's had a very long day, I know. Please, please.
Os está agradeciendo la presentación y dando enhorabuena por la pieza, que es una pieza central de la exposición hoy, y también por la historia que estáis contando, que es a la vez fascinante y trágica. Y la pregunta es, ¿sigue siendo doloroso que tengáis que utilizar un proceso legal para reclamar vuestros nombres?
Hola. En la investigación logramos identificar 3 cosas importantes. Que para unas personas, en el caso de mi hermano, era importante hacer una rectificación de nombre de forma legal, para decir...
In the research, they realized about 3 things. The first of them is that for his brother, it was very important to... Perdón, ¿que era muy importante?
Era importante hacerlo de forma legal como una disputa política frente al Estado.
It was very important to do it in a legal way to make it a political dispute for the state.
En otro sentido, otras personas no se cambiaron el nombre de forma legal, sino espiritual.
For instance, other people decided not to change their names on a legal way, but only on a spiritual way.
Okay.
Y otras personas encontraron el nombre en los sueños de sus abuelos, en los mensajes de sus padres. Encontraron y se apropiaron de ese nombre. No para todos era importante la legalidad, pero sí lo importante de llamarse como consideran llamarse.
And for others, they found their names in their dreams and of their parents and grandparents, but for them it was not necessarily as important to do it in a legal way, but to actually find their proper name.
Es doloroso que el Estado y sus instituciones sigan negando la lengua, los territorios sagrados, los ecosistemas propios de vida, pero el proceso de resistencia y dignidad van a la par.
It is, of course, still painful that the state still denies the processes of acknowledging the languages, the sacred territories, the ecosystems that allow for life, and, of course, the resistance processes that come with the dignity process.
Thank you so much. Should we open it up to the audience? Questions? Anyone? Up.
Is it a microphone? Oh, yeah. Okay. I think it's a thought and a question at the same time. I feel like when we talk about secrecy and keeping things for oneself and cultures for oneself, it's like we're living in this world where we're oversharing all the time, and the technologies that are at our hand are all about sharing what we're doing, what we're thinking. Is this like oversharing of vulnerability and constantly telling all the invisible viewers how we're feeling and how our day was, right? And I feel that actually the ones who don't share so much, like, it makes me think about intelligence, on how much we share, and actually the oversharing nowadays is related to not being so aware, or not being like having a certain way of intelligence. And yeah, how can I frame this? I'm just thinking about the thought of oversharing, and I get with how we are all oversharing right now with the technologies that we have at hand, and the act of keeping secrets, and how the idea of keeping something secret can also inform the technologies that we are using and producing, be it AI or the new things that we're having at hand. If that makes sense.
Yes. Does anyone want to respond directly? Or we could take another question while we think. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Okay, yeah. Yo quería preguntarles para el proyecto de Inti Yauri. En realidad, me parece bien interesante el reconocimiento de las opresiones coloniales, raciales, el abandono del Estado-nación y de la población blanco-mestiza. Lo que yo quiero preguntar es, detrás de esta investigación que han generado para mostrar su propio proceso de violencia y de la comunidad, ¿cuál es el proyecto que se hace detrás de eso? Detrás de esas piezas que se muestran en un espacio expositivo, ¿cuál es el trabajo con la comunidad que se hace? ¿Cómo estas piezas se vuelven activadores de procesos sociales?
The question, he's recognizing, of course, sí, primero la traduzco y luego traducimos, ¿vale? The question, the person who's asking the question recognizes, of course, the oppression, the colonial and racial abandonment of the nation state and the población blanco and the population, white mestiza population. But he's asking, behind the artwork and all that process, what's the actual community work? It is what is the artwork activating behind of all of that?
Sí, nuestro campo de enunciación ha sido el arte, y el arte tiene una poética visual y una política contestataria, ¿no? Es decir, somos conscientes de lo que nos atraviesa y también nos interesa poner en reflexión esos temas de una forma, a veces, como en las primeras imágenes, como muy directas, y a veces sutilmente también desde la poética de la memoria, ¿no? Es decir, las piezas que formaron parte de los tejidos. Sí, fui muy lejos.
They work in the field of the art as a field where enunciations, no, can be made on one hand through a visual poetics, but also through a contestatory politics. ¿Puedes repetir lo último, por favor?
Sí, es a nivel político, ¿no es cierto?, y poético. Y en este caso, en el caso de estas piezas, unas son directas como para poner en evidencia algo, como la foto, digamos, del corte de trenza que, paréntesis, en el 2025, en octubre, 2 compañeros quichuas fueron cortados del cabello por los militares en las manifestaciones, ¿no? Es un tema que no es anterior ni que no es visible, sino más bien fue un hecho muy fuerte y discriminador, digamos, ¿no?
Okay, so some of the pieces are put in a very direct manifestation and confrontation, such as the piece of the braid, no? And as a parenthesis, he's telling how in October last year, 2 members of the community were cut off their braids by members of the military in a very extremely racist and violent gesture.
El proceso tuvo un diálogo con distintas generaciones, son 3 generaciones de los años 70, 80 y 90, de las personas que empiezan como a rectificar el nombre, pero es un tema que no es individual nomás, sino no son solo estas 17 personas las que nosotros entrevistamos, es una realidad que nos acontece a todos, y desde nuestro campo del arte consideramos poner en evidencia desde la memoria del tejido esta situación muy particular.
Okay, so the name reclamation process is a multi-generational issue. No, it goes through 3 generations, at least operating in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Therefore, it's a collective matter. And here, through the using the textiles, they are manifesting as well this reality.
Los artistas han hecho música en los levantamientos. Los artistas han hecho poesía, han hecho murales. Las personas se han levantado en nuestro campo desde las artes visuales. Ponemos a considerar estos temas que son como muy personales, pero que también rebasa lo individual y es un digamos, una situación colectiva y comunitaria.
Artists have done music, poetry, mural painting, and through personal manifestations that also go beyond the individuality in this matter and this issue, which is collective and community-based as well.
More questions? Yes.
Yeah, thank you so much for all of you. Gracias por sí, todas las presentaciones. Yeah, so I have also like, I don't know if it's a question or more of a comment, right? Because especially from the talk of Adriana. Well, like, yeah, of course, like we think of Europeans as like, for the major part as this well, colonial entity, and also we inherited. But as I forgot your name, you were saying in your talk, right? We also have our own responsibility towards our own history and how we erased our own connection to our relationships and our lands. And well, we do have, let's say, a sort of endangered group of people also in Europe, but I guess in all the world, which are the people that at the moment they refuse to create practices and relationships based on economic transaction, no? And I'm thinking about activist and autonomous groups that exist, and they are also sort of counteracted and try to erase from their own countries in Europe. And then I was thinking about this idea because it was very interesting, the talk from Adriana talking about this protection through, let's say, silencing ourselves. And there was also, like, related to technology, there was this very interesting talk about AI that I saw recently, in which they were talking about this example of Maori people who use AI to sort of like preserve the language, like as a sort of use of that. And then people, for example, from the hacker scene, they were saying, well, we have always done work in order to be open source and available to everyone because that's our values. And then this software is always made better than the commercial software, and at the same time with values that are close to more community and social values. And then AI sort of has scrapped all this code to make a use that these people don't agree with. So, I mean, this is only one example about the hacker scene. But then I would like maybe to hear of an advice or like a sort of wish in order to keep also these communities in Europe or in also, you know, in the Western world that sort of fight against the the dominant system and especially the economic system. How can we talk and learn from each other in order to have the same fight in this part of the world?
Every time that I talk to my students, for example, about these reflections, and we talk about decolonization, I explain them that it's quite difficult because this act of observing these critical situations about intercultural dialogue are complex, etc. But I said decolonization, the difficulty is that it's not only about observing or discovering of being critical, it's about yourself. So in that sense, I think that the exercise of the last years is quite simple and complex. Simple because it's not a group that has to react, it's not a society that has to react, it's every one of us. we have to contemplate the situation, be aware of the situation, and ask ourselves what's our position in this situation. Because this is the other side of the world conceives the whole existence of the world as a dynamic where they are included. And that's something that the other side of the world, the Western world, doesn't quite realize. But let's do that, for example. We are also part of all of these critical situations. So what can we as persons do? It's not only the activism or there is some group in some place that could do something, another community that could something. Every one of us could be able to reflect about that, to analyze what's your position in all of this. The very simple daily things, because there are systems that are creating this imbalanced situation. And what's my role there? How do I think about that? What's my position about that? This kind of exercise is quite useful. And maybe we are not going to be able to do much, literally, go on action or whatever, but the act of reflection, the personal reflection, is already a very political thing. Because if every person begins to reflect in that way, the whole community, the whole world is going to, at a certain point, wake up and say, hey, that's not correct, or we are going to change of way. But it has to begin somewhere, and it's going to begin with every one of us.
Okay, you got the last word. Okay.
Yeah, I mean, that's partly why I made this little thing, which is like a reflection kit for us to actually work with. Because I think in that journey, right, all that research, which we usually talk about in terms of, decolonial research, we go to archives, we write things. What we don't talk about so much, right, is the body and the spirit part of it that we actually have to go through, right? In order to even do that work, it's really has been kind of a journey of like really reflecting, working through my own traumas, working through my own kind of ancestral issues, things that have been passed down, and really starting from there. And I think like it took me years before I even dare to sort of say that, okay, I am doing decolonial work, because that took actually so many years of these critical reflections that you so rightly mentioned. And it really starts from that kind of integration work that you do from within yourself that is much more like on a psychic level, on a bodily level, that goes really beyond what we can just talk about on a kind of discursive side.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think we got the sign to wrap up, so I think we'll have to leave it here. But please, I hope the audience can feel free to come and ask more questions if you have them of this wonderful stellar panel. Evelyn, Adriana, Inti, Yauri, and the amazing Lisa. I mean, she's done the Lord's work. Really, this was really. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. And up next will be the Buentech ceremony, award ceremony. So please, for those of you who can, please stick around for that. See you soon.